Welcome to Unit Design 101, where we break down the overall factors that make units useful in Fire Emblem and beyond. Whether you're a ROM hack creator or merely interested in overall design, this resource is for you. This week we're discussing the original flying unit, the Pegasus Knight, and whether they stand out from, match, or suffer in the shadow of the Wyvern Knight. Pegasus Knights have existed in every Fire Emblem game and have managed to maintain a very similar stat block most of the time. With notably high speed and resistance, but generally lower strength and defense, Pegasus Knights tend to match up well against mages and decently against Myrmidons in a straight-up fight, but often struggle to deal with Armor Knights or Axe Fighters and are generally slightly weaker than Cavaliers. Often joining in the early game with fairly subpar base stats compared to your other units, even at such an early chapter, the first Pegasus Knight in your army is meant to teach you the power of flight, reaching objectives that other units can't, hiding in safe spots over mountains or oceans between sniping kills, or, in games with rescue and pair-up, shuttling slower units to important locations, are all incredibly valuable tactical moves that flight opens up. Training Pegasus Knights for combat, then, involves managing how many turns of utility you're giving up for turns spent attacking and in danger. Early training is important, however. As with their fairly low base stats, most early game Pegasus Knights will quickly become too weak to deal meaningful damage and too fragile to survive a round of combat against a normal enemy without some dedicated training and good level ups. Shadow Dragon Sita, with her forgeable rapier effect Wing Spear, is the biggest exception to this rule, but pretty much every other game that gives you an early Pegasus Knight tends to make them weaker than most of the other units you have at base. Even Pegasus Knights that are considered viable carry units, like Sacred Stone's Vanessa, still need several early level ups just to keep up with enemies, let alone the rest of your army. Mid-game Pegasus Knights often have a higher focus on combat, with generally better growth rates than their early joining sisters, but base stats that still reinforce their fragility in direct combat. This means training them for combat is still effortful, but will tend to be more reliable in creating a combat-focused flyer over time than training most early game Pegasus Knights. Late game Pegasus Knights come in two flavors, Est and Juno. Est flyers tend to join with similar stats to their mid-game counterparts, but several chapters later, often with either higher growth rates or some other unique attribute to help them stand out. Juno flyers are pre-promotes, who join with fairly mediocre base stats for their point in the game, who are mostly there to provide additional flying utility or just to fill out a triangle attack, whilst having combat utility similar to the mid-game flyer had at their join time at base. In other words, it's technically workable, but they won't be strong enough to survive much on their own. With all of the broad types of Pegasus Knights covered, let's zoom in a bit on their matchups versus mages, the looming threat of archers, and then compare them to the frontline flying tanks, Wyvern Riders. Mage matchup in particular is a notable strength of Pegasus Knights for several reasons. Their high resistance is an obvious part, taking less damage on average than almost every unit type except for clerics. A Pegasus Knight with decent resistance can fly into a field of mages and probably survive better than anyone else, even with their lower HP pool. Speed is the other benefit the Pegasus Knights have over other units. Mages aren't incredibly fast, but they generally aren't slow either, so a unit with above average speed can consistently double them. This is important because a Pegasus Knight's low strength means that they rely on doubling in order to deal efficient damage. Luckily, the mage's low defense means that even with their lower strength, a Pegasus Knight can still deal significant damage, often one-rounding mages at close to base stats, despite failing to one-round most other unit types. A safe, effective matchup, and one of the closest things to a hard counter matchup that traditional Fire Emblem has. Speaking of hard counters, however, the flyer is at the receiving end of one, and that is against archers. Bows, ballistae, and especially Tellius crossbows all have the potential to completely erase Pegasus Knights from existence. Before effective damage negation comes into play through Delphi Iota Philly shields, the Pegasus Knight is the recipient of the most common effective damage type in the game. No other class is universally vulnerable to an entire class of weapons in every single Fire Emblem game. Hammers and Horseslayers can be threatening to Knights and Cavaliers, sure, but not every enemy fighter or soldier is holding one. The effective damage that bows have, combined with the low physical defense of Pegasus Knights, means that every archer or ballista's attack range needs to be considered an instant death range for Pegasus Knights, zoning out their flyer utility and severely hindering their combat potential. This can be used by clever designers to create a web of danger with carefully placed safe spots, most notably in ballista maps, to still allow Pegasus Knights some utility while limiting their freedom until the ballistas are taken out. Many maps with ballistas overlap their ranges, however, such that Pegasus Knights are almost entirely unusable. But if Pegasus Knights have such a hard time with archers, don't Wyvern Riders suffer the same fate? In some ways, yes, their arrow weakness in most games makes Wyvern riders just as vulnerable to archers and ballista as Pegasi. However, their significantly higher defense and HP stats often allow Wyverns to survive a hit or two that would completely drop a Pegasus. While not as speedy and having poor resistance stat on average, the average Wyvern's high defense, strength, and hit points make it far more durable, like an armor knight with flying mobility. The Pegasus's hardest matchups then become survivable at worst and actually favored at best for a Wyvern, and the only matchups Pegasi have over Wyverns, mages, become similar to how mages work against every other unit type. Hit them first or you'll get hit hard back. This is why the typical Pegasus Knight will take a lot more training and effort to reach the combat prowess of your average Wyvern Knight. The utility of the Pegasus Knight is sometimes superior to the Wyvern's utility. In the GBA games, for instance, the odd reversed aid calculation for mounted units means that Pegasus Knights with their lower constitution on average can carry much heavier units than Wyvern Knights with their higher average constitution can. Some later Pegasus Knights also have staff access, or get it on promotion to Falcon Knight, providing them with additional non-combat utility to make up for their frontline combat deficits when compared to Wyverns. But what if you wanted to emphasize the unique combat matchup potential of a Pegasus Knight? This is where Gaiden, and to a lesser extent Shadows of Valentia, shine. Promoted Falcon Knights get the Slayer skill, providing plus 10 damage versus monsters in SOV, and setting their attack regardless of weapon to its max of 40 versus monsters in Gaiden. This is a heavy-handed and over-the-top method of forcing combat utility into a class, but given the difficult training arc of an unpromoted Pegasus Knight, and the relative lack of utility in many maps of the game, giving the Falcon Knight this incredibly strong ability was an interesting way to set it apart and make training them to promotion worthwhile. So to sum it all up, Pegasus Knights are built to be fragile at base, emphasizing utility more than direct combat capabilities, at least before serious training investment. Pegasi are built to directly counter mages at the cost of poorer matchups against most high defense or high strength units. Archers completely zone out Pegasi as the hardest counter in all of Fire Emblem. If you are designing maps, be very conscious of where your archers can shoot to deter or encourage certain Pegasi flight paths. Compared to Pegasi, the massive amount of physical bulk and strength that Wyverns have is almost always superior to the Pegasi's speed and resistance, though Pegasi often have superior utility and better unique matchups, such as versus mages. And that's all the time we have for today. If you have comments or questions about Pegasus Knights, leave them in the comments below and I will respond either directly or in a future Office Hours video. If you want to talk Fire Emblem or other games with my community, join the Discord, link is in the description. If you would like to support the channel directly, YouTube memberships start at less than $1 a month and come with bonuses like early scripted video access and exclusive access to gameplay videos and other content that would hurt my algorithm because my general viewership doesn't tend to watch it. Speaking of YouTube members, a massive shout out to the Royal Laguz Guard, Sal Mellon, and the Laguz Guard tier of C2 Peekly, Enigmatic Mr. L, Mad Moke, Bro Duderman, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Lakag, and Relaz6. Thank you so much, and until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.